1988, a woman broke 40 years of silence. She was a nurse. She had been present at Roswell Army Airfield in July of 1947. She had been in the room, and before the being on the table died, before whatever it was stopped breathing, it communicated something. Not a warning, not coordinates, not a confession about where it came from. It asked a question, one question, and what it wanted to know has haunted me since the first time I heard it. I want to start inside the room. Not with the crash, not with the debris field outside of Roswell, New Mexico, not with the rancher William Brazel discovering something on his property on the morning of July 3rd, 1947, not with the initial press release from the 509th Bomb Group that used the word flying disc before the story changed overnight. I want to start where the nurse started, in a room she described as cold, deliberately cold. Cold in a way that she said felt less like temperature control and more like intention. Her name, as it appears in a recorded interview conducted in Tucson, Arizona on September 14th, 1988, is given only as Margaret, no surname. The interviewer, Mashpai, a private researcher named Dr. Carl Fenwick, whose notes and recordings were later donated to a small archive in Albuquerque, agreed to these conditions. Margaret was 63 years old at the time of the interview. She had been a military nurse stationed at Roswell Army Airfield beginning in the spring of 1947. She had signed documents, many documents she described as unlike any standard military non-disclosure agreements she had encountered before or since, and she had kept quiet for 41 years. What breaks a 41-year silence? That's the first question I found myself asking when I listened to the Fenwick recording for the first time. What finally moves a person from silence into speech? Margaret's answer, when Fenwick asked her directly, was simple. I'm dying, and I don't want to take it with me. She was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in early 1988. She died in February of 1989, approximately 5 months after the interview was recorded. Dr. Fenwick has since also passed. The archive in Albuquerque, the Southwestern Anomalous Phenomena Research Collection, which operated out of a small building on Marble Avenue, closed in 2003 under circumstances that were, at minimum, poorly documented. What remains is a partial transcript, a single audio cassette copy of questionable fidelity, and a handful of written notes in Fenwick's hand that were photocopied and distributed among a small circle of researchers before the archive shuttered. The deeper you go into the provenance of these materials, the more you understand why this story has never reached mainstream conversation. Not because it lacks substance, but because the chain of documentation has been interrupted at nearly every conceivable point. That is either an extraordinary coincidence, or it is not a coincidence at all. In the transcript of the Fenwick interview, Margaret does not spend much time on the question of what the being looked like. She describes this as almost beside the point, which itself is striking. A woman who has carried an image in her mind for 4 decades, and the image is not what she leads with. She leads with the atmosphere, the feeling of the room. She was called in, she says, not as a primary medical attendant, but as a secondary observer. There were doctors present, military doctors, at least 2, possibly 3. She was uncertain because her attention, she admits, was not on the humans in the room. She was positioned near what she described as the upper left corner of the space, close enough to see clearly, far enough to remain peripheral. Her role, as she understood it, was to record vital signs on a secondary monitoring device. She had been given minimal briefing. She was told there had been an accident involving foreign personnel. Foreign personnel. That phrase. Consider it for a moment. Foreign personnel. It is the kind of phrase designed to be technically accurate while communicating almost nothing. And Margaret said she accepted it, initially, because acceptance was the path of least resistance in the military environment of 1947. You did not ask, you reported, you recorded, you kept your eyes on your instruments. Until she looked up, the being, she says, was approximately 4.5 feet in length. It was on a table, not in a conventional medical sense, but on a flat metallic surface she had not seen before in any hospital or base medical facility. Its skin, and here she pauses in the recording, and you can hear the pause, a full 4 seconds of silence before she continues. Its skin appeared greyish and smooth, without visible pores, without the texture of human tissue. Its head was disproportionately large. Its eyes, she said, were closed or nearly closed. Its hands, and she specifically mentioned the hands, returned to them twice, had 4 fingers, elongated with no visible nails. She observed no obvious wounds, no lacerations, no burns. Whatever had injured this being was not visible on its surface. What she does describe, at length, is its breathing. Shallow, irregular, and accompanied, she said, by a sound she struggled for years to characterize. She settled in 1988 on this description. Like a sound you hear inside your own head, not outside, inside. She was not the only one who heard it. One of the military doctors stepped back from the table. Margaret noticed this. She noticed it specifically. A trained military doctor, a man who would have seen battlefield injuries, who would have operated under pressure, and he stepped back from the table. Why? She never found out. He did not speak to her afterward. Nobody in that room spoke to her afterward. She was escorted out, debriefed in under 12 minutes, and told to return to her regular duties. The entire episode, as far as her official service record was concerned, did not happen. Here is where I need to slow down, because everything I've described so far, the room, the being, the strange acoustics of its breathing, all of it is, in a sense, almost standard within the body of Roswell testimony. There are other witnesses, there are other accounts of the cold room, the metallic table, the large head, the silence afterward. The contours of this story are, within this particular research community, familiar. What is not familiar is what Margaret describes next. Approximately 12 to 15 minutes into her time in the room, she estimated this later. She had no watch. The monitoring device had no visible clock. The being's condition changed. Its breathing, already irregular, began to slow more dramatically. The sound she described as internal grew fainter. One of the doctors moved to the head of the table. There was communication between the medical personnel in a low register she could not fully hear. And then the being's eyes opened. Not fully. She was emphatic about this. Not fully open. A partial opening. Enough. She said she became immediately, viscerally certain that it was conscious. Not regaining consciousness. Already conscious. Already aware of the room. Aware of the people in it. She said she felt this as a physical sensation. Not metaphorically. She described it as a pressure behind her sternum, the way you might feel the subsonic rumble of a distant explosion before you hear it. A presence, an intelligence, something registering her specifically, in her corner of the room from across the space. And then, and this is what Margaret spent 41 years carrying, it communicated. Not in words, not in any language structure she recognized. She said later to Fenwick that she believed the doctors nearest the table received something more complete, more complex. What reached her at her distance was what she could only describe as an impression, an emotional shape, the way you sometimes wake from a dream not remembering the images, but retaining the feeling of the dream perfectly intact. The impression she received was a question, not a statement, not a warning. A question. She was certain of the distinction because, and this is her phrasing, recorded verbatim in the Fenwick transcript, a question has a shape different from an answer. This had that shape, the open shape. She sat with this for a moment in the interview before continuing. Then she said, it wanted to know if we knew, if we had any idea yet, if we understood what we were. Read that back. If we understood what we were, not who, not where, not how, what? The question, as Margaret received it, as it registered in whatever pre-linguistic processing happens beneath conscious thought, was ontological. It was not strategic, it was not territorial, it was not the question of a species assessing a threat or an asset. It was the question you ask of something you consider, perhaps not fully formed, not complete, a question of recognition. Do you know what you are? I have spent a long time sitting with this question, and the longer I sit with it, the more it resists comfortable interpretation. Because think about what that question implies. Think about what the being would have to believe about us, about humanity, to ask it in that context. Dying. On a table in a cold room in New Mexico, surrounded by military personnel with instruments, in the last minutes of its life. And the question it sends out into the room is not help me or why or even who are you. The question is whether we understand ourselves. That raises a simple but critical question of its own. What did it know about us that prompted that specific inquiry? Margaret told Fenwick that she didn't sleep properly for 11 years after the incident, that she developed what her personal physician characterized as a persistent anomalous auditory condition, a low intermittent sound she heard internally, not externally, which began 3 weeks after the incident and did not fully resolve until 1958. Her physician attributed it to tinnitus. She attributed it to something else. She never specified what. Fenwick noted in his handwritten marginalia on the transcript that she became visibly distressed at this point in the conversation, and he chose not to press. He drew a question mark next to the word tinnitus and underlined it twice. Here's where the official explanation doesn't just bend, it breaks. If Margaret's account is fabrication, it is a remarkably specific fabrication. The details she provides about the layout of the medical facility at Roswell Army Airfield in July 1947, the corridor dimensions, the location of certain auxiliary rooms relative to the main infirmary building, the type of monitoring equipment in use, these have been cross-referenced by Fenwick and, later, by at least 2 independent researchers with access to declassified base layout documents from the late 1940s. The spatial details check out, not approximately, specifically. She also describes the scent of the room. Antiseptic, she says, but beneath it something else, something organic, not human, that she compared to the way a low-tide beach smells in winter. Cold salt and something living underneath. 2 other Roswell witnesses, interviewed independently and with no apparent contact with Margaret's account, have used remarkably similar olfactory descriptions. One of them, a retired Army corporal whose interview was recorded in Flagstaff in 1991, described it as like the ocean in the wrong place. The pattern here repeats with a regularity that is difficult to explain away. Witnesses who don't know each other, witnesses who have no documented contact, witnesses describing the same peripheral sensory details in the same terms, and then, almost uniformly, documents go missing, transfers get lost, assignments disappear from personnel files. Margaret's service record for the period of June through September 1947 has a gap. Fenwick noted this. He had contacted the National Personnel Record Center in St. Louis, the same center destroyed in part by fire in 1973, a fire that consumed an estimated 16 to 18 million military personnel records. Margaret's records are among those listed as unrecoverable, along with those of approximately 12 other Roswell-connected personnel whose names appear in early researcher documentation from the 1970s and 1980s. 12. All unrecoverable, all from the same window of time, all from the same installation. What are the statistical odds of that? I'm not asking rhetorically. I'm asking genuinely, because once you calculate the probability of that clustering, once you actually sit with the math of it, the explanation of random archival loss becomes increasingly, almost impossibly, fragile. Margaret was not, it turns out, the only person who claims to have received something in that room. In a document circulated privately among a small network of anomalous phenomena researchers in 1994, a document I accessed through a secondary source and whose original author remains unknown, there is a brief reference to a second medical observer present during the final minutes of what the document calls the primary Roswell biological subject. This second observer, whose name is given only by initials, EL, is described as having experienced a persistent intrusive impression following the incident, characterized as an unresolved question, a cognitive fragment that could not be consciously processed or discharged. EL reportedly sought psychiatric evaluation on 3 separate occasions between 1948 and 1954. The presenting complaint in all 3 cases was described by the attending physicians as recurring ideational fixation of unknown origin. One physician's note, quoted in the 1994 document, reads, "Patient reports a sense of being asked something they cannot answer by a source they cannot identify at a moment they describe as pivotal." Being asked something they cannot answer. That phrasing. From a psychiatric evaluation in 1951. Before the term Roswell had entered public consciousness, before any of the witness accounts had been publicized, before the story had a shape that someone could unconsciously absorb and repeat. And here's the strangest part: the ideational fixation that EL described to their psychiatrist, the recurring impression of being questioned, centered, according to the 1994 document, on a specific conceptual territory. Not location, not identity, but nature, the nature of the human species, what humanity was, what it was becoming, what it might not understand about itself. The same question from a second receiver, documented in a clinical context, independently. Once you see it, you can't step back from it. The Fenwick recording ends abruptly, not with a conclusion, not with a final statement from Margaret, not with a signed-off farewell between interviewer and subject. It simply stops. Mid-sentence, as far as the transcript indicates. Fenwick's notes do not explain why. There is a handwritten asterisk at the bottom of the final transcript page, and beneath it, in smaller script, equipment failure, remainder unrecorded. Equipment failure. At the precise moment that Margaret, if the transcript order is accurate, was apparently beginning to describe what happened in the room after the being's eyes closed again. After the question had been received, after whatever transmission had occurred was complete. The silence that follows that asterisk is, in its own way, as loud as anything in the recording that preceded it. Researchers who have handled the original Fenwick cassette, the single surviving audio copy, report that the tape does not show signs of tampering or deliberate erasure. The degradation pattern is consistent with a genuine recording failure. The speed fluctuates, the audio quality deteriorates across the final 30 seconds of recorded material, and then the signal simply drops, which could mean nothing. Magnetic tape fails, equipment fails. This was 1988, not 2026. Or it could mean something more specific. It could mean that whatever Margaret said next, whatever she described happening in the room after that final transmission, is simply gone. Not hidden, not classified, not suppressed. Gone. The ordinary entropy of the physical world doing what it does, erasing what cannot be filed, what cannot be declassified, what cannot be managed by any human mechanism. The universe, it sometimes seems, has its own archival policy. I keep returning to the question itself, to its shape. Do you understand what you are, if I try to think about this from the perspective of a species that had travelled by whatever means to arrive at this particular planet, at this particular moment in the mid-20th century? A species that had observed us presumably for some period of time before arriving, or at least upon arriving. A species intelligent enough to traverse whatever distance separated its origin from ours, and in its final moments, wounded, dying, alone in a cold room on an alien world, surrounded by beings it had come to or was sent to investigate, the message it chooses to transmit is not a plea, not a warning, not coordinates, not a declaration. It is a question about our self-knowledge. Why that question? What does that question imply about what they found when they looked at us? What gap had they identified between what we are and what we believe ourselves to be? What did their observation of humanity reveal that prompted, in the final breath of a dying consciousness, not we come in peace, and not we mean you harm, and not any of the things our science fiction has trained us to expect, but that, just that. Do you know what you are? Margaret died in February 1989. She took with her whatever came after the asterisk. She took with her 41 years of processing a question that has no frame in human philosophy, a question from outside our conceptual atmosphere, directed inward, aimed at the core of our self-understanding. Dr. Fenwick's notes are gone. The archive is gone. E.L.'s psychiatric records, if they ever existed beyond the 1994 document, have not surfaced. The being on the table in that cold room in Roswell in July of 1947 is gone, whether incinerated, preserved, or something else entirely. There is no public record that says anything verifiable. What remains is the question, and questions, unlike records, cannot be archived, cannot be classified, cannot be destroyed by fire or equipment failure, or the careful management of institutional memory. A question, once transmitted, persists. It propagates. It arrives in new minds through old tape recordings, through photocopied transcripts, through the handwritten notes of a researcher who underlined a word twice and placed a question mark beside it. It arrives here, in this moment, in your mind. What other questions did it have? What else did it